Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first lesson for A-Level Global Politics. This is the series of lessons that will apply for the Edexcel A-Level Politics course, and we're going to begin in this lesson by talking about the concept of the nation state and some of the consequences that exist as a result of our conceptions of the nation state. Now, I will make it very clear that I'm going to try my very, very best to stay in the field of global politics when talking about this course and try and stay away from talking about international law. But of course, the two things cross over quite a lot, as you will probably imagine. So, in some ways, there is a certain utility in having someone like me whose speciality is international law teaching global politics, because I can bring to the table a number of different things that you might not otherwise know about global politics and about the sort of international community as a whole. But on the other hand, you might find me in some cases rambling about international law, and that's just, I'm afraid, a consequence of me teaching this series of lessons. So, specifically in this lesson, we're going to introduce the concept of the nation state, the modern Westphalian understanding of the nation state since the Peace of Westphalia that took place in the 1600s. And we'll talk about some of the key terms relating to the politics of state, and then we will examine some what we would describe as realist interpretations of the importance of the nation state in both international law and global politics as a whole. So, when we conceive of the concept of global politics, we do so by thinking about relations between states. And now, when it comes to the sort of general terminology, we don't tend in global politics or in international law or in political economy to talk about the concept of countries. Countries is a more colloquial use of the phrase. In reality, we talk about the concept of the state. And so within these different subjects, within global politics and within international law, the way in which we refer to countries is using the concept of the nation state. It's a much more technical way of saying it. It's a much more precise way of saying it. And it applies a lot more of the theory that has been developing over the hundreds of years that we have conceived of the modern nation state. It applies that to this phrase as well. Now, in terms of a definition, you could say that the nation state is defined as a sovereign region. Okay, we're going to be focusing on that word sovereignty in a minute. But it's a sovereign region that is linked politically and often shares a number of historical and cultural heritage. So, what I mean by linked politically is that we have a certain territorial region that exists as a single political entity. So, for example, France is a nation state in the sense that it is a single defined region that we can point to on a map, and that it shares a political heritage, it shares a cultural heritage, it shares a historical heritage, and it shares a single unified government structure. Okay, now this can be a federal government structure in the sense like the United States, where there are different levels of the government. You have state governments and you have a federal government on top, but there's still a centralized political tradition that exists in, for example, the United States or Germany as well. And so that's what we mean when we talk about the concept of the nation state. And in international law, when talking about what actually defines a state, there are a number of different characteristics that we can look at to come to the conclusion as to what actually makes something a state, what makes something a nation state. And an example of this is the Montevideo Convention on the Rights and Duties of States. They list 4 criteria in Article 1 of this convention. Now, a convention is just another word for a treaty. An international treaty is just an agreement that is made between 2 or more states, and the Montevideo Convention is one such example of these of such a treaty. Now, the 4 conditions are as follows. In order for something to be a state in international law, according to this convention, there has to be a permanent population, there has to be a defined territory, although the definition of this territory need not be entirely delimited in the kind of way that means that you could point to it on a map. There can be some parts of the region that is defined that can be that can be in some kind of dispute. So, for example, in a lot of instances, at least in the modern conception of the nation state, the concept of a breakaway state is something that exists. This is the idea that a part of a country wants to declare its own independence and break away from the rest of the country. And an example of that, there might be some disputed territory. But so long as there is some region that is defined as this is in what is encompassing our potential state, then you tend to be fine when it comes to the Montevideo Convention. The third is the concept of a government. This can link to our definition, as you notice, with the concept of a political tradition that is linked together within the nation state that shares some kind of legal sovereignty. And then the final of these criteria is the capacity to enter into relations with other states. Now, in terms of political theory or in terms of legal theory, there is a little bit of a debate to be had about whether or not the fourth of these criteria is just a criteria that is arisen because of as a consequence of satisfying the previous three. The idea being that the three first criteria are actually physical criteria that exist in the real world. There has to be a physical permanent population. There has to be a physically defined territory. There has to be some kind of government that is obviously physical in nature. But the concept of a capacity to enter into relations with other states, that's more of a theoretical interpretation. And the idea being that if you can satisfy the first three, if you can satisfy the fact that you have a permanent population, you can satisfy the fact that you have a territory, and you can satisfy the fact that you have a government, you then automatically would have the ability or have the capacity to enter into relations with other states. That's just a little bit of theory there for you. Whatever the debate may be, you can talk about that in the comments if you want. Now, with all this being said, with all of these different definitions that we've got swirling around on this page, one of the logical consequences of the existence of the state is the idea of state sovereignty. Now, sovereignty is a word that we're going to be using a lot in this series of lessons. Of course, we've been talking about sovereignty in A-level politics more generally when talking about, for example, the sovereignty of Parliament, or the sovereignty, if you will, of the US Constitution in a sense when we did US and comparative politics. And sovereignty simply refers in this context to the unlimited power that is given to a state to issue legal authority in the region that the state is defined. So where we have a state that is defined, the United Kingdom, France, USA, Germany, etc., etc., sovereignty refers to the power that the government has in being able to dispense with unlimited legal power in that region. Now, again, the existence of the nation state comes with it this existence of state sovereignty. The modern conception of the nation state, the logical consequence of the modern conception of the nation state is this idea of state sovereignty. The idea that there is a certain amount of sovereignty that is enshrined by the government of that state to that region that is in question. It means that no other nation state will have legal sovereignty over the region of a different state. So, for example, the UK government does not have any legal power to enforce laws in France, for example. No matter how much we think parliamentary sovereignty is universal in nature, we do not have that ability in terms of the conception of the nation state. It would be a violation of international law to think otherwise. And all of this dates back to these older principles of the modern nation state, the concept of the Westphalian principles of the state. And the concept that you will note, and we will reference back and forth when we talk about states in global politics, is the idea of a Westphalian conception of the nation state, the modern Westphalian nation state. And it is derived from the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Now, what the Peace of Westphalia did in 1648, it marked a formal end to a very a conflict that existed across all of Europe, which was, of course, the 30 Years' War. And in doing so, some of the Westphalian principles that still exist today, one of them being the concept of state sovereignty. Another one includes the idea of recognition of other states within international law. So the idea being that you ought to recognize the existence of other states, you should recognize the legal sovereignty of other states as it applies to the region in which they are governing. With all that being said, let's talk a little bit before we go about the concept of the realist and how they understand and they conceive the notion of the state. Well, according to Realist, it is the existence of the nation state that is the most important actor in both international law and international politics. And they make very, very clear that while states may vary in size, so for example, there is a difference in size between the Vatican City and the Russian Federation. One of them is very, very large, the other one is very, very small. There is also a disparity between different states in terms of their strength, whether that be economic strength. So, for example, a state like South Sudan is economically not as prosperous as a as a state like the United States of America, which is obviously the most economically prosperous. And then we have disparities in terms of population. For example, China is very, very different in terms of the amount of population compared to the Philippines or compared to Portugal. These are all different examples of the different varieties of countries and states that exist. They all, though, share a number of things in common, according to the Realist, and these are the ideas that are linked to the Westphalian views of the modern nation-state. According to the United Nations, as of 2019, there are 193 nation-states that exist. There are others that seek recognition. Of course, there are other regions that seek to try and break away from this conception of the between other states as well. Scotland being a notable example when it comes to the United Kingdom. You also have the much more controversial example of countries in inverted commas or regions that exist within the state of Ukraine. For example, the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. They allegedly, according to people who live there, want to break away from the state of Ukraine. Of course, this is very controversial considering that the amount of influence that is had by the Russian Federation is something that is to be debated. But as of 2019, as of the time of recording this as well in 2022, there's not been any new states since then. There are 193 nation states that exist as per the United Nations. Now, before we finish, let's just talk about the concept of other institutions within global politics. We've been focusing a lot on the idea of the nation state. What about institutions within global politics? While realists view the state as the central part of global politics, there are other institutions that exist. So, for example, what do we say about the recognition of, say, the United Nations in terms of international law and international politics? Well, the United Nations themselves make certain claims as to their own recognition in global politics. So, for example, we have actually a case here from the International Court of Justice. So, as a bit of a background, let me just outline what the ICJ is and the kind of cases that are brought to it, because this will prove useful when we talk about other cases in the future and when we talk about other institutions of global politics in the future as well. So the International Court of Justice, as situated in the Peace Palace in the Netherlands, in The Hague, can be described as the judicial organ, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations. It's essentially the primary court that exists for the United Nations. Now, what the International Court of Justice does is it has jurisdiction, or it has competence over two different kinds of legal route. So on the one hand, it has what is known as dispute competence. It has competence over different disputes that exist. So if, for example, two countries are involved in a dispute over a certain territory, so let's say there's a region within a country and a different country thinks that that part is actually part of their country, well, the ICJ will go and it will have jurisdiction and it will have competence over that kind of dispute. We can have other disputes relating to maritime boundaries, relating to the use of force in terms of one country invading another country, etc., etc. That is one kind of case that can be had at the ICJ. Another kind of case, and as is the opinion here, what we have in this case is known as the advisory jurisdiction, or the concept of the advisory opinion. Now, what the advisory opinion is where another institution of the United Nations, most of the time this be the General Assembly, the United Nations General Assembly, will actually ask the ICJ for a legal opinion on some particular issue. And while these are not actually legally binding in the fact that they are not brought about by some kind of dispute, an advisory opinion, of course, indicates very, very heavily where the court would actually rule in terms of if they actually became a dispute in the future. And so this case here, the case on the reparation for injuries suffered in the service of the United Nations, is talking about, it's an advisory opinion, and it talks about the kind of reparations that are granted to people who worked for the United Nations, who had suffered, who had been killed in the service of the United Nations, and recognizing the United Nations as to whether or not it has any kind of legitimacy within both international law and within global politics. This case, it was held that the United Nations has recognition in international law and in global politics in a similar way to that of the nation state. Now, of course, there are differences between the concept of an international institution and a nation state, because these are obviously different things, but there is still different types of recognition that exists within global politics, and the United Nations is one such institution that has global recognition. There are obviously other institutions that we can think of as well. So, for example, the International Criminal Court is an example of an institution that is given global recognition. Of course, we have the International Committee for the Red Cross and Red Crescent. Now, this is actually an international organization that was founded before the United Nations, which is quite interesting. And we obviously have the 1995 establishment of the World Trade Organization. Again, this is an example of a global institution that exists, that gives some amount of, or is given some amount of legitimacy in global politics. There are obviously others. We can talk about CITRA, the United Nations Institution for International Trade Commission that sits in Vienna. We have that as well. There are obviously investment tribunals that exist. We obviously have human rights tribunals that exist. We have tribunals relating to the environment and environmental law that we will talk about. All of these things are different institutions that exist within global politics. The next lesson, what we're going to do is talk more about the nation state and the concept of the nation state existing on a global level, which means talking about the different types of globalization that exists within geopolitics.